Okay, what up? It's middle of the night because I decided to start the stream way too late because time got away from me. But I've decided tonight I'm going to do a, let's see here, screen, there we go. I'm gonna do a breakdown, and this is just basically just gonna be, how do I say this? R.I.P.D 2 is on Netflix right now. Came out a couple days ago. I hate watched it, having seen the first R.I.P.D in theaters. That one had Ryan Reynolds and whatever his name is. I'm all over the place here. Hold on. Let's see. Poster. Anyway, the first R.I.P.D had Ryan Reynolds and the dude. And it's based on a comic, and it's, you know, it is what it is, but it went really badly, and it was in sort of the era where Ryan Reynolds just kept getting flops. I believe Green Hornet was a couple years later, or a couple years before, but anyway, so nobody was asking for R.I.P.D 2, and we got it anyway. R.I.P.D 2, Rise of the Damned, starring Jeffrey Donovan, the guy from Burn Notice, because they couldn't get Jeff Bridges or Ryan Reynolds back, so instead they got this guy, Jeffrey Donovan, from Burn Notice, and you know, that kind of stuff. Whatever. The point is, this movie is ridiculous. It's a let me pull it up here. By the way, it's 50 rating, 50-ish ratings on IMDb or Rotten Tomatoes, but it only has one critic review, like actual critic review. So it's garbage. That's actually gone up though. I feel like 31 it went up. Yeah, all right. Why is there this huge banner? I don't know. Anyway, R.I.P.D 2. Is it going to give me a... Why is it not giving me the... Stop. I don't need to see an ad for the Fablemans. What is happening here? Anyway, okay. So let me try to summarize, because it's not going to let me, what R.I.P.D 2 is, because I did watch it. That happened. That is the thing that happened. Yeah, so R.I.P.D 2 has nothing to do with R.I.P.D other than the fact that it's the same premise. R.I.P.D took place in the present time, and the idea is when you die, if you're a certain kind of soul that has unfinished business, or if you die in some sort of way, basically the same idea is if you become a ghost. In this universe, if you die in a way that's conflicted, you get sent to the R.I.P.D to become an officer for an obscure amount of time. I think it's like 100 years or something, to hunt escaped souls who take over bodies, and it's got this wild CGI, and the souls have these abilities, and you have these special weapons that can destroy, you know, escaped souls. It's the whole thing, and it's very cartoony. It's like if Ghostbusters was like you know, a silly cop movie, I guess. I don't know. R.I.P.D 2 is different in that it's a prequel that takes place in the 1860s in, I want to say Kansas? I don't know, in the West. It's a Western. It's a Western with escaped souls, and yeah. What else do I want to say about it? They still have the special weapons, because so much of this movie is about trying to explain the context of what they're doing, because for some reason, instead of just, you know, having characters experience a story, this entire movie is, we start a scene and we try to explain what's happening and why it's important, sort of as it happens, so that we know. God, what are the zombies even? What are the monsters even called? God, I don't even know. I realize now I don't even have the nomenclature for what they did, because it's just you know. I was folding laundry when I did this. Let's be honest. I was folding laundry because there's nothing to look at. Okay, let me just get into it. So let me show you what I have here, which is this right here. This is a chart. This is a I don't know what I would call this, a premise chart, or just a questionnaire. Basically, the idea is I've worked as a script reader for, you know, agents, managers, companies, competitions, everything. This template actually came from a script reading template from a major production company whose owner rhymes with Blonde Bloward. And I worked for them for a little while. And so this is basically the top chart when I would be given a script to do coverage on, which is basically just read the script and then summarize it and then grade it, with the expectation that most of them get sent to the throwaway pile and some of them get sent up the ladder, and then the ones that get increasingly up the ladder get in front of Blonde Bloward or maybe his partner Major, and maybe they get made and maybe the writer gets a call. So yeah, I think their template, it was like 2 pages, and so the first page was I think you would use their log lines, so you would use the writer's summary of what happens, and then you'd have this grading rubric, and then you would write like a 1 or 2 page summary of what the actual script was and the quality of the script and the quality of everything. And so this is about the story. What we're looking at here is the story. I think that's very important to acknowledge, that I think the best chance any movie has of success starts with the story, because ultimately that's what people are going to care about. The spectacle, the all that kind of stuff is great, but if you don't have characters having human experiences, experiencing emotions, and giving you the ability to connect those characters, you're fishing in dirt. So yeah, so let's just talk about it. So I'm gonna score this 1 to 5, 5 being it needs to be made today, and 1 being as bad as it gets, bordering on not speaking the native language of whatever it's supposed to be in. So in this case it's English, so a 1 in this case is it's so bad it's incomprehensible on a speaking the language level. Let's just go through it. Concept, R.I.P.D. Well, it's, on its face, there's no wrong answers, because it's based on a Dark Horse comic, and it's based on a premise that certain souls, when they die, they come back as law enforcement officials for these sort of the underworld or the otherworldly beings that just happen to be on Earth, everybody else. So it's a pretty strong concept. It's very pulpy, it's very silly, and that's very important, because this is not one of those serious, fancy things. I'd say concept, I'd give it a 4. We'll call it a 4. So it's a very high score. Very, very, very interesting concept. I would call this a high concept. High concept is the what if. Low concept is just human interaction. So like a family drama, I would consider low concept. What if you're a gunslinger who shoots and arrests escaped souls that are inhabiting human bodies? That's high concept for sure. Originality. Well, it's a Dark Horse comic, so on that side, maybe, or maybe not. But as far as the amount of the lousy amount of escaped souls being arrested by cops that can't die because they're already dead, I'd say pretty high. So I'd give it a 4, because you can talk about the 5s, like we know all the 5s basically. Like The Matrix is a 5. Commercial viability. Well, this is a complicated one, because we've already had a version of this movie fall on its face already. So and it had a much more famous pair of actors in Ryan Reynolds and Jeff Bridges compared to Jeffrey Donovan. So commercial viability, if this wasn't what it was, if this wasn't called R.I.P.D 2 Rise of the Damned, I'd say it's a pretty interesting commercial idea, because it's a big spectacle, like shoot 'em up adventure. But based on the fact that it's known for being the sequel to what was astoundingly a flop, like such a massive flop, and it's in a time when flops didn't necessarily fall that hard. Commercial viability, I'd say it's a 1. Which I think is the point of why it quietly showed up on Netflix, and it wasn't advertised. It just sort of was here. Yeah, I mean, like, I can't think of a movie other than something to do with taboo topics or just absolutely inappropriate topics that have less of a commercial appeal than what this movie was, which is kind of why I wanted to do this chart in the first place. Commercial viability. So that might be the big stumbling block that we're gonna have to work on. Cinematic potential. I give it a 3. The first one, as we know, just based on looking at the trailer, I wouldn't say cinematic, because it was just CGI fest, but it's interesting. This one is a different kind of cinematic because it's a Western, but again, that's one of those things. One of those Hollywood cliches is don't write a Western because they don't sell. I mean, there's in the you know, given the fact that there's 8 billion people in the world and there's X amount of movies made every year, Westerns do get made. But if you count up all the Westerns, especially Westerns that were successful in Hollywood year by year, there's less and less. There's basically like one every year at this point, and it's usually like a Tarantino or another like huge name makes the Spielberg or what's Dirty Harry? What's his name? Eastwood and make them. That's about it though. Westerns are pretty popular on TV suddenly, but they're just not a thing in movie theaters compared to everything else. Moving on. Quality of lead roles. The reason I picked this rubric is most of the time when I'm scoring stuff for reading, quality of lead roles doesn't really get much attention because it's usually about getting the idea. But I do put a lot of stock into the quality of lead role because one of the most efficient ways to get a movie made is to get an actor, the script in front of an actor who wants to do this movie. That's why you see not all of a sudden, but lately, every major female actor in their 30s or 40s has a movie where they're the hero in it. That's because of the quality of the role, because they have these production companies specifically set up for themselves to try to farm roles that are not the wife or the sister or the hooker or the whatever, especially for the female actors that have a lot of panache these days. I think quality of lead roles is really an underrated thing. Quality lead roles in R.I.P.D. Well, in the first one, again, because this is only going to live in the shadow of the first one, it was Ryan Reynolds and Jeffrey the dude, or not Jeffrey the dude, whatever his name. Anyway, the dude. So quality lead roles, I mean, Ryan Reynolds fit the role. So Jeffrey Donovan fitting the role, I don't know. Based on having seen the movie R.I.P.D. 2 Rise of the Damned quality lead roles, he's as much an Indiana Jones cartoon character as he is a real character, so I'd say 3, generously 3. Anyway, moving on. Emotional resonance. This is interesting because, again, I think this is one of those things that people don't pay attention to very much. I can fix the comp. I realize I'm not even in the comp. Let's just go ahead and let's do this. Emotional resonance is really interesting because I really do believe that whether or not people are satisfied with the movie, whether or not people are satisfied with the TV show, especially because TV is much more about character development and character evolution, whereas movies are offering an experience first and usually character second. The great exception is definitely the Avengers and all of Marvel's connected universes, because they're basically making character development forced into it because the characters are retained and arcing over the course of, Thor is a good example, or the Hulk, they're different because they're changing. Whereas movies, you really only have 90 minutes or 2 hours to do a thing, and so the character doesn't need to change, but it's not this slow and intimate process the way TV is. Emotional resonance, again, yeah, tracking the character's emotions, tracking the character's experiences, and having emotional reactions to it. As human beings, we do. That's really what I think the movies are. Emotional resonance of a Western about hunting. They're called deados. I forgot about that. They're called deados. Hunting deados and killing them with fancy spiritual guns. On the face of it, no. Having seen the movie, the actual emotional resonance that he's working towards is 2 things. One, he's sort of kind of interested in figuring out who killed him and getting revenge, even though it's told early on that there's no point in trying to get revenge on the person that killed you. Every R.I.P.D. officer tries to, and they fail because it's just not what they do. And so he does have this sort of C or D plot where he's trying to find his killer. But the emotional crux of the story is he's trying to ensure that his daughter has a good life. And part of that is one of the people he teams up with, or one of the people that's in the story as like a CC story character, is his daughter's fiance, who he finds to be inept and just not a good man. Like, not a bad guy, but just kind of weak, like a limp-wristed man. Whereas he's the sheriff of the town he was in, so he's like the big alpha male, and so he just doesn't respect the guy. And so over the course of the story, it's learning to not only accept the new guy for who he is, a different definitions of masculinity, which is going to be interesting for thematic resonances. But as far as emotional resonance, yeah, it's just about him sort of worried about his daughter. But as far as the actual experience of how it went, it's very surface level. It's pretty hollow. It's pretty shallow, and I attribute that to the quality of the writing. Honestly, it's just, you know, I think they really tried to make a concerted effort to make him care about his daughter and about his daughter's fiance. But at the end of the day, it's shoot him up with CGI monsters, and that's really what most of the story is trying to be. So emotional resonance, I give it a generous 3. So all right, moving on. Thematic resonance. This is interesting. It's especially interesting now because you hear terms like woke or anti-woke, and this movie is neither that nor that. Although, to be fair, when you come back in this universe as an R.I.P.D officer, you don't come back as your own person. And the joke in the first one was Ryan Reynolds was a little Asian man, and Jeffrey Bridges was a hot chick. And so in this version, he comes back as a black pioneer woman or a black cowgirl. I'm not sure. In the context of where they are, I can't speak to whether that's accurate, but just based on understanding race and racism in America, the idea that they're pioneers and that these black women are basically running around arresting people is a very interesting buy historically. So maybe that, I wouldn't necessarily say pandering, but maybe that's an interesting avenue that they explored. A worthwhile pursuit in a pulpy genre movie, probably not. Other than that, again, thematic resonance. The thing you do when you take the story out of the present is now you're able to compare our present with whatever the story is. So in sci-fi, it's the utopia or the dystopia or the difference in future, whatever. In a Western, it's how backwards the West was compared to our evolved society. That's usually the go-to. Is it done here? I don't know. 3. I mean, it's not bad. It's not like Smokey and the Bandit where you watch it now and you're like, wow, they had a man say that to a person. It's not that. So, you know, it's not made from hate. It's not made of hate, or at least we'll see if that ages well. We'll see if that made of hate phrase ages well in 20 years, but we'll see. Uniqueness and development of world. Again, the big trick and the big struggle with R.I.P.D 2 Rise of the Damned is every single time there's a plot point, it takes 5 minutes to explain, and it has to have probably the Jean character, the woman, explain it. Let me pull up the poster again, because again, most of this movie is the two of them. He's sort of like the old town sheriff, and he's very, you know, I'm a cowboy. This is the West. They basically did the thing that comedies do when they do a period piece, where they literally say what era they're in, even though that wouldn't make sense in the context of it. He was basically doing that the whole movie, and she's out of time herself because she is French-ish, as French as you can be, even though her accent is pretty decent. That was pretty white trashy of me. Anyway, but she's French, and she has a sword, and so everybody else obviously doesn't have swords. They have guns because it's the Wild West, but she has a sword, and that becomes a whole plot point. Anyway, uniqueness of world. Well, again, if the concept is a 4, I'd say the uniqueness is I'd say a 3, just because it's a unique world, but it feels absolutely artificial. Whereas R.I.P.D, the first one, it was a unique world in that there's two worlds, one layered on top of each other, the living world and the ghost world, or the demon world, or whatever. You know, the classic, there's a layer of magic we can't see. You're a wizard now, Harry, that kind of stuff. As far as uniqueness in the context of what it is, this thing, I mean, it's a Western about ghosts, and it's kind of out of time because he as soon as he goes to the R.I.P.D, they talk like 2022. So I don't know. I'd say a 4 just because the concept is high, but hard to give that credit. Tone. I think this is one of the big weak points of this story. Is the tone. It's it's a Saturday morning cartoon. It really is. It's a Saturday morning cartoon where people die. It's very campy. It's very schlocky. It's very silly. It definitely runs into stereotypes more often than not. I don't know. Tone is tricky because tone, it's in writing, it's the author's tone. So it's two things in writing where it's not only the tone of what's being presented, but it's how the author is saying words, the screenwriter, the author, the whatever. So in tone in movies, it's really how the director did it. I consider tone in this just to be how it's presented for what it is, and it's like a 10-year-old boy wrote this. And it has the thought processes of that of a 10-year-old boy. And so would I say the tone is good? No, I'd say the tone is imperfect. And it's certainly different from R.I.P.D. because, again, this thing permanently lives in the shadow of the first one, which is objectively a better movie, even though it was absolutely horrible. Yeah, so tone of this one, I'm giving it a 2, and I think I'm overestimating it. Yeah. Tone is what separates movies from each other. Tone is the difference between, if you look at the 1960s Batman TV show, campy, schlocky, pow, the Dark Knight version of Batman, very, very dark, very brooding. The Robert Pattinson Batman, he's emo, tone. So, and X Factor. And X Factor is the last one. Does this movie have X Factor? Well, if it wasn't the sequel to R.I.P.D., I would say yes, because it's another take on R.I.P.D., which is a pretty well loved comic book series, and it's established. So originality, the only card that's not up here that I guess fits under X Factor is it established IP? Because especially movies, but not just movies, are made from established intellectual property. That seems to be what the common movie is nowadays that comes out. I don't agree with that because Jaws, Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope, like all of these movies that we consider to be the great movies of blah, blah, blah generation are the first usually. Predator, Alien, they're the first. And so the sequel is an established IP of Alien. So Alien 2, whatever it's called, I don't know, you get what I'm saying. So I guess that falls under X Factor. X Factor, I give it a 1 because it's a sequel to a movie that is famously not good, and famously nobody saw it. The one of those. So there's like a bunch of things in Hollywood that you do and you don't do. Basically, it's like a learned behavior, and so one of them is, every actor, when they come up to you to shake your hand, no matter who they are, no matter how famous they are, no matter how, many things they've been in, they will shake your hand and they'll be really nice and they'll be really cordial and all this kind of stuff because it's the gig. Like, we know of the exceptions to those, but they'll shake your hand and they'll say, "Nice to see you." Instead of "nice to meet you" or "good to see you again," they say "nice to see you," which is tricky because it basically means, I don't know whether I've met you before or whether this is the first time, so I'm going to split the difference and make it sound like if we've met before, nice to see you again. If we haven't met before, nice to meet you. Nice to see you. So in the same way, you don't badmouth a failed movie. You just don't. So when you're doing comps or comparisons, when you're pitching stuff, you talk about successes. And so even if you have a really, really, really brilliant take on something like, what's a good example? Firefly, a Western, even in itself. Even if you have a really brilliant take and it's inspired by Firefly because Firefly is one of your all-time favorite shows, it's one of mine. Most of the time, unless you're talking to somebody who worked on Firefly, you're not going to compare your show to Firefly because it was a failure. It's beloved now, and so there's an argument to be made that if you do your research and you find the person was a fan of Firefly, maybe you could do that. But in most situations where you're just cold pitching something and it happens to be similar to Firefly, you're going to say it's similar to Deadwood or it's similar to Star Trek. You don't say Firefly because Firefly was a failure, and it immediately convinces the person you're pitching it to this also could go down the road of Firefly and be a failure in itself. So you just don't do it. R.I.P.D. 2 is comparing itself to R.I.P.D. by literally being the sequel of R.I.P.D. It's referring to a famous box office failure already. Good God. Good, like, can you think of a worse idea in how to pitch a movie? And so I want to start from there. Now that we have everything up on the board, the concept is in pretty decent shape. The originality is in pretty decent shape. Cinematic potential, that's going to really be up to the budget because it's a high concept, and so there's a lot of different ways it can be played. Quality of the roles, it is what it is. Emotional resonance, that's going to need some script work. Thematic resonance is going to need some script work. Uniqueness of world is directly tied to the concept. Tone, again, is going to be a writing thing, and I would argue most of rewriting these days, unless you're trying to change characters, unless the studio is just not happy with how things are going, tone. If the tone is inconsistent, that's the biggest problem. Other times, the tone is just too different from what you pitched or too different from what the studio wants, and you have to fix the tone. This is especially true in comedies because you have to do punch-ups or you do joke rewrites, usually to adjust the tone. That's why first seasons of comedies especially are all over the place, because they're trying to figure out the tone. They're trying to figure out a bunch of other things too, because certain characters work out of the box and certain don't, but a lot of it is figuring out the tone. And so if you think of like the first season of The American Office, very dark, kind of mean-spirited, very reminiscent of the British Office, which had its own thing going on. But they pivoted in the second season by changing the tone of the show. So the structure of the show was the same, but the tone itself was a lot more, had more levity, had more optimism, and especially Michael Scott's character, instead of being this caustic sort of backwards person who's just there to sort of antagonize people, they changed it and they made Steve Carell's character a little bit more sympathetic, a little bit more of a buffoon with a good heart, because they realized the tone was not really compatible with the Americans' understanding of how an office comedy would work. In this case, I think the tone is just a monster. In that that's going to be the last thing they have to fix, because it's going to take everything else to get fixed before getting to the tone. And X Factor, I'm just using as the bin for everything else I can't describe, and most of that is the fact that it is handcuffed to R.I.P.D, the original one. So let's let's look at this. So commercial viability. Well, okay, so obviously the ones are commercial viability and X Factor, but I think you can fix that just by thinking it through. Well, it's called R.I.P.D 2 Rise of the Damned. That's banking on people possibly having watched the first R.I.P.D and liking it, that's the craziest dice roll I've ever seen any movie do in a very long time. More likely, the explanation of R.I.P.D 2 is they're going for fans of the Dark Horse comic R.I.P.D. And so, yes, they're sort of acknowledging to people who were not fans of the Dark Horse comic that this is the sequel, and maybe you were a fan of the other movie. I've yet to find a person that was, but I'm sure in 8 billion people there are a few out there. But the fact that it's called R.I.P.D 2 is directly referencing the first one, which was a failure in its own right. What a terrible misguided idea. Yeah. How do you fix the commercial viability? Well, you either don't call it R.I.P.D at all and just abandon the idea that you're going to try to cash in on the fact that it's a Dark Horse comic. That's tricky and probably won't I don't care about keyframes. That probably won't fly, because if you're a studio and you're going through the trouble of licensing an intellectual property like a Dark Horse comic like R.I.P.D 2, you've already paid, or you will pay, or the royalties are about to expire. That actually could be why this movie got made, because we still live in a world where royalties get bought and then they ultimately expire, and so they probably were required to make a sequel. Oh, as I'm saying out loud, that's probably what happened. So they probably, when they bought the rights to R.I.P.D, the Ryan Reynolds one that they ultimately made, they probably bought a 2-picture deal with X amount of years in between, 12 years or 13 years or something. Oh, probably 10. Okay, so R.I.P.D came out in 2013. So probably 10, they probably bought the rights to the Dark Horse comic property R.I.P.D for 10 years with an expected 2 movies in order to retain the rights. They did this with the Fantastic Four in the 90s, I believe, where they made a straight-to-video Fantastic Four that didn't have any actors in it that were named. It was just absolute garbage. And they made it as quickly as possible in order to retain the rights. They do this. Sony has to do this with Spider-Man periodically, which is why we see Spider-Man so often, because they have such a complicated rights rules. This could just be the equivalent of the Hollywood version of patent trolling, where they have the rights, but they're about to expire unless they do something with it. Honestly, that's probably why R.I.P.D. 2 Rise of the Damned exists, and why they had to call it R.I.P.D. 2. That's my theory. I invite anyone to prove or disprove that theory, because now that I'm saying it out loud, I'm actually convinced that that's probably what happened. Yeah. So they had to make a movie within 10 years, otherwise they're going to lose the rights to it, and maybe they have plans down the road to make a proper one. I would argue the amount of money they spent on this one, this was an honest college try, but who knows, maybe not. And it was on Netflix, but I don't know if it's a Netflix original or not. I mean, I can look. Let's see what the production company is. Oh, the reviews are hilarious. Let's see. Production, box office, TV Pro, Donovan. Say the production company? I can't tell. Oh well. Neither here nor there. Okay, so commercial viability. This thing was dead on arrival because it's the sequel to a movie that was dead on arrival. They tried to church it up a little bit by making it a Western, which for me, who's a person who reads scripts constantly, and occasionally I'll come across a Western, I'd say I've seen probably 100 vampire scripts and 100 zombie scripts for every one Western, but they're out there. Actually lately I've been seeing a lot of like steamy, like 50 Shades of Grey style stuff. It used to be teen dystopias. That was really hot for a while. That was kind of when I started. But the steamy stuff now, and then now it's a lot of like based on a true crime, whatever, trends. Don't chase a trend. By the time you have your script in front of somebody who could make it, the trend will have inevitably passed. And if you want to wait 30 years, you will have a very reasonable chance of the trend coming back. But you can't like, there's no way to prove that. Yeah. So commercial viability. Well, ignoring the fact that this is almost certainly trying to retain the property for some down the road plan, because they already had the rights to it. I'm convinced that's what it was. Even if that's not the case, commercial viability. How do you change this and make it like a 3 or a 4? It's you call it R.I.P.D. and not 2. So it's a full reboot. It's not a sequel. It's not a, hey, we know you liked the first one. Here's your favorite characters and favorite world again, because it's not that anyway. It's just a completely different thing. And I think that's worth a 3 or a 4. So yeah, there's how you fix the commercial viability of it. Is you know the Dark Horse comics, or even if you don't, this is a crazy Western, blah, blah, blah. Oh, another good example of a failed Western with a high concept, Cowboys and Aliens. The last thing Jon Favreau did, I believe, before he did Iron Man. Again, one of those things that had way too much money behind it, and it wasn't going to work, just couldn't work. I admittedly enjoyed a lot. I think Daniel Craig absolutely crushes it, but it's one of those where if you're pitching something and you're pitching a Western with sci-fi elements, the last thing you want to pitch is Cowboys and Aliens, because everybody knows that to be an absolute humiliating failure for everybody involved. And it ain't worth it. So don't pitch Cowboys and Aliens. It sucks. It sucks that that's that way, but that's what Hollywood is. It's not a meritocracy. It's a society of opinion. And so opinions change. Roman Polanski is never going to get another movie made if he ever even comes back to America, and inevitably goes to jail. But the opinions of his movie were what they were, and then he did all the terrible things, and now he can't come back to the US because he will be charged with whatever he was charged with. Woody Allen is sort of in that situation. He's getting Me Too'd all the time. But again, everybody had really high opinions because he's a very high functioning writer director. But at the end of the day, his brand is such that it hasn't aged well. It just hasn't. It doesn't help that he's married to his stepdaughter, which is, insane. But anyway, moving on. So just call it R.I.P.D. and just acknowledge the fact that this is not the present day. This is the Western. This is the West. That's a fun take. That's the whole idea of doing a Western or doing a magical realm or space opera. That whole thing is, what if you took your favorite characters? Batman is famous for this, and so comics themselves are famous for this. Batman is famous for this. There's a Batman that takes place in like the Wild West. Batman in the Wild West. Again, I'm not a comic person, so it's not my thing, but I understand the thought process, and it's a fun exercise, and I believe that's what R.I.P.D. 2 Rise of the Dam was trying to be. So what if they just call it R.I.P.D. Rise of the Damned? So it's the first time this happened, but you don't even need to do that. I would just say R.I.P.D. Stockton 1870 or whatever place they were. I don't even remember. I think it was Kansas. R.I.P.D. Kansas 1870. That's really interesting. That's considering how many TV shows that are Westerns right now are like, what is it, 1887? Or Yellowstone? Why 1887? The Yellowstone prequel. Like it doesn't help that that's the guy that did Wind River and Sicario, so he's kind of the GOAT, but you get what I'm saying. So we got the number up there, and then X Factor, and X Factor is tied to commercial viability. The X Factor is what's unique about this, and so it's two things, and that might be what's so dangerous. Is usually you want the X Factor to be the high concept, and so in this case it's, what if when you die under certain circumstances you come back as a police officer that arrests and kills the undead that inhabit bodies? That's the X Factor normally, but they added another layer on top of that, which is, what if that took place in the Wild West? Have you heard of the phrase too many magics? Have you heard of the phrase mixing magics? It's when you have too many complicated things. It's the great example of it working is Star Wars, because you have wizards and you have space. So you have space wizards. Japanese manga are all about this, but in the traditional sort of Western storytelling definition, it's an extra level of difficulty to pull off something that has two competing sort of thought processes. And so like Harry Potter, it's just magic. It's muggles and it's magic. And so they're two opposing ideas. Muggles are not magical and magical people are magical. But if you add technology to it, then it gets an entire layer more complicated, and that adds risk to selling the idea. Like, not selling as in like sales necessarily, but just the emotional buy-in of the audience looking at the idea. So what's the X factor on this? Again, it's chained to R.I.P.D, but it's also the fact that, like, what is going to be about this movie that the Ryan Reynolds the Dude movie did wrong? And part of that is the absolutely horrible CGI. I can testify right now that the CGI in this is at least as bad, and it's been 10 years. It's crazy. So how would you X factor that? I would just not call it R.I.P.D at all. I think the solution to this whole thing is just not call it R.I.P.D at all, and just call it something else. And just know that, and maybe have a reference to something deep in the Dark Horse comics that lets the Dark Horse the 5 Dark Horse fans that are inevitably going to see this, unless word of mouth is such that it travels, a tip of the hat to let them know that this is the R.I.P.D. You don't have to call it the R.I.P.D. Again, for the sake of intellectual property, you have to, because that's the whole thing that studios are ponying up all this legacy money for. But you don't have to, and so just don't call it R.I.P.D. Call it the undead in the West. And again, I would just literally call it the the name of the town that they're in and the date. I think that's the move. So I would say again, Stockton, 1877. And it's sort of like a From Dusk Till Dawn thing where, if you haven't seen From Dusk Till Dawn, it's one of Tarantino's earlier movies. The first half of the movie is a heist running for the border. George Clooney's in it, and it's very straightforward of just these guys probably killed somebody and now they're running to the border, but they have to wait, and so they hold out in this bar. And then the second half of the movie it's a bar of vampires, and so there's this really incredible sort of tone shift, again tone, that goes from a heist movie to a like genre vampire shoot 'em up, gory, gutsy thing. I think you could do that there. I think the first third of this movie could just be the sheriff's sort of like pursuit of the bad guy, and then he dies, and so at the end of Act 1 he dies, and so for the other 75% of the movie, now he's undead, and now he's hunting an entirely different level of evil, in that these demons have inhabited people's bodies. I think that's worth it, and I think the big switcheroo, the fact that they're burying the fact that it's R.I.P.D. is actually doing the best for the project, because it's letting people know this is just a movie. Forget what I think the great thing about original movies that I'm really attracted to the most, as opposed to intellectual property, is the great pitch of any first movie, any original idea is, forget what you know about anything, we're going to give you our movie. That's the whole thing. That's why Star Wars is the gold standard for building a universe, because Episode 4, A New Hope, basically said, we don't care what you know about society, we don't care what you know about stereotypes, we don't care what you know about this. We're going to give you the sad little moisture farmer who's an orphan, who's living with his aunt and uncle, and then the wild guy with kind of a mullet who shoots first, and then they had to retcon that to make him shoot second, which was gross, but it's an adventure. So come on to this adventure, and you're going to learn about the adventure as we learn about the adventure, which is a really good storytelling situation. Bring the person who's new in, bring the new nurse into the ER, bring the new student at the community college, like bring the new person in. In this case, it's Jeffrey Donovan's sheriff character. He's in a world that he understands. He dies. Now he's new. Now you're off to the races, which is what they did with the first movie. Yeah. So it's a Western for 20 minutes, and then for the next hour and 40 minutes or hour and 20 minutes, it's a, rootin' tootin', let's kill bad guys that are demons in the West. Yeah. Cinematic potential. Well, you have the Western, but you also have up to interpretation of how you're going to portray this stuff. In the case of the fact that it's an R.I.P.D. movie, it's going to be for 13-year-old boys. Let's be perfectly honest. And so the gore and the death and the stakes and the consequences can be tuned to that of a 13-year-old boy. That's going to be the tone. Obviously, it's nice when there's a plethora of different age groups represented, especially emotionally, because again, a 48-year-old sheriff is not going to have a 13-year-old boy's mind, which is one of the traps the actual movie, I feel like, itself fell into. Jeffrey Donovan played a 13-year-old boy in a Jeffrey Donovan body for the entire movie, as did everybody else. So to credit where acting credit is due, actors can only play the role they're given, and so whether or not the director gives them more information as they act out their scenes, it's neither, that helps, but at the end of the day, the actors are making an educated guess on what they think is going to be the most truest presentation of the character they're trying to portray. And in the case of the movie that we got, again, Jeffrey Donovan just probably looked at his son and was like, how do you feel about shooting dead guys? I'm doing that. So what else do we need to look at? Thematic resonance, emotional resonance, and again, tone. These are all things that need to be worked on in the script, in the writing. It's a time thing. I don't actually begrudge the screenwriters or the screenwriter for how that all panned out, because they were definitely being overseen on some level. But I'm a big believer that the reason things that are considered badly written tend to be badly written. It's not because the writers are hacks. It's not because the writers are bad. It's that either they didn't get good guidance in what whoever was in charge, the studio, the financier, whatever, asked for, but more likely it's time. It's why if you watch well-written shows, all of a sudden there's that one episode, sometimes it's episode 7, sometimes episode 11, depending on how long the season is, where the episode just seems off, just seems a little worse. Writer fatigue. And more likely what happened was, in the case of shows like that, you try to write as many shows ahead of time before the show starts getting on the air to try to build yourself padding. But eventually, if your show is like on CBS, for instance, and it's a 20 episode show, even if you start shooting in like the summer, at some point in October when the show starts airing, the show will more or less catch up to the writers. And at that point, the writers either are so burned out that they're just, it's a worse quality product more likely coming out, or the other option is they just don't have time. Episode 1 they had, or episode 2 they had 5 weeks to get it right, and then another 4 weeks before it's getting on the air in case they had to fix something. Episode 7 they might have had 9 days. In the case of R.I.P.D. 2 Rise of the Damned, I'm strongly of the opinion that however much time the writers had was weeks or months less than they really could have made a stronger quality product out of. That's my opinion. Again, I wasn't there. Yeah, so R.I.P.D. 2 Rise of the Damned. Let's wrap this up real quick. Is it a good movie that's worth watching? And are you willing to use 2 hours of your time on Netflix to watch it? Best of luck to you. I would never say don't watch anything, because again, a person's preferences, a person's taste, how you're feeling that day, that's all going to vary. Is it objectively a good movie? No, not even close. Is it objectively a well-written movie? Absolutely not. It's hideous, and it was physically hard to sit through, and if I wasn't doing something else, I would have definitely turned it off. But I'm also one of those people who I used to be one of those people who I'll see it to the end, no matter how bad the movie is, or that kind of thing. Life's too short. If the movie's not worth doing, if I didn't think I was going to do a video on it, I wouldn't have finished it, because there was nothing redeeming. One of the big takeaways from being a screenplay reader, a coverage reader for everything, is that everybody. Okay, so screenplay readers, for instance, or script readers, it's a cliche that it's depending on the competition, depending on the company, they might expect you to read all 120 pages of script, or they might expect you to cut it off at a certain point. I've had different versions of every kind. Some companies are like, time is money, read 10 pages and read the last page. And some of them are like, we're paying you to be here. If it's a 400-page manifesto, you're reading 400 pages today. I have never once read a script after page 2 that I went, oh man, this is horrible, I hope it gets better, and it got better. Never once. There's been many scripts where I've been like, holy crap, this is incredible, I hope it gets better after page 2, and yes. And there's also been scripts where after page 2 I go, I don't know, but I'm having a good time, and half the time it's gone well, and half the time it's gone absolutely horribly. But in the case of watching something or reading something where I'm 2 minutes in, 2 pages in, 10 minutes in, 10 pages in, and I'm going, I'm going to have to take a wire brush to my skin after this because I feel so horrible. It's never gotten better. And every reader, every teacher, every manager, agent, producer that I've talked to, yes, there's always that fear. There's always that, I don't know, I could be passing up on the next Diablo Cody. That's every producer's absolute fear is, what if I pass on this person because she kind of looks like Diablo Cody? What if she's the next writer of Juno who wins a screenplay, who wins an Oscar for screenwriting and used to be a stripper? I want that. I want to be the person who found that person. That's what every producer, whether or not they want to admit themselves, they want to be the next person to find the next Diablo Cody. However, if it sucks in 2 minutes, it almost certainly won't get better. One of the crazy reversals is from Dusk Till Dawn, Tarantino's movie. Again, the vampires show up halfway through the movie. But if you actually watch the movie, if you actually read the script, the first half of the movie is an extremely satisfying, well written, well plotted, well set up movie with George Clooney, who is, you know, one of the most handsome men in the history of the human genome. So it's a good movie, and then it's a different movie. It's not a horrible movie that turns and becomes better. Yeah. So yeah. Final thoughts. You know, it's easy to hate something that's terrible. It is. It's also easy to love something that's good. But at the end of the day, there's so many factors in making a movie. It's so time consuming. It's so expensive. I've heard it referred to as opening a restaurant, and then immediately, as soon as you do the first night, you no longer have the restaurant. You have to now open another restaurant. It's like that. Which I think is a really apt analogy, considering restaurants, is it what, like 90% of them fail in the first year? I think that's a really apt analogy, but movie making is expensive and hard and takes forever, and requires a level of collaboration and coordination that is very, 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 very hard to achieve, which is why the movie making community is not nearly as big as something like, I don't know, apartment construction or, you know, a government of any kind. It's a lot, and it doesn't help that a huge chunk of movie making and TV making and any kind of, you know, creative pursuit, it requires creativity, and that's a very hard to nail down thing. And when it works, it works, and when it doesn't work, it could be as simple as one little adjustment makes it work. Like it's incredibly unpredictable, and those that get good at recognizing when it's working are those that stay in the business, that have success. The big inspiration for me these days is somebody like Andy Samberg, who he's constantly changing his career, he's constantly pivoting, but at the end of the day, he knows that if he has to just go sit down with his two buddies and just make videos for a while, he can get back to that, and that seems to be working for him too. So wild and crazy ride. You don't need to go see R.I.P.D 2 Res the Damned. It's a garbage fire, and at best it comes off as dated, and at worst it comes off as a really condescending sequel to a movie that nobody wanted to watch in the first place. Catch you next time.